common ground issue that everyone, no matter what their political persuasion is, can agree on is the importance of education. We need to learn the facts and not depend on road, websites, or Facebook for information. The best way to do that is to hear what the experts who have experience have to say. We must come together as a community to meet the challenges, and we hope that providing this information can help that occur. Leanne, we are so happy to have you back again, so come forward and tell us what the facts are.
So before I begin, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about me and who I work for. It was introduced that I am the Director of Governmental Relations for the North Carolina School Boards Association. The association represents all 115 public school boards in North Carolina, plus the Cherokee Reservation School District, so 116 strong. We are a nonpartisan organization. Most of our school boards in this state are elected on a nonpartisan basis. And so we work with Democrats, Republicans, Independents. It is typical for me, if we are invited to any type of a forum like this, to try to accept those invitations, because we think it is important to let people know the facts of what is going on. So I want to start with we're going to start way up here and drill down about what is going on with public education in North Carolina. And I first want to give you a little bit about the constitutional requirement in this state, because it's a little bit different in North Carolina than in other states, the way our courts have interpreted it. And the General Assembly shall provide by taxation and otherwise for a general and uniform system of free public schools. We then have had a court case that has been around for about 20 years now. It's called the Leandro case. Actually, Mr. Leandro graduated from the Hope County Schools, went to Duke, is now a lawyer with actually the firm that started that case in Raleigh, which I think is just a really interesting little fact. But that standard for our students in our schools is that every child be provided the opportunity for a sound basic education. And then the courts go on to define what that sound basic education should look like. So when we look at our funding, our schools statewide get 62.1% of their funding from the state. So that is a clear majority. 26.2% of the funding on average in the state comes from local funds, and 11.7% comes from the federal government. So the federal government really plays the slightest role in how we fund our schools. Sometimes when you listen to the banter coming out of Washington, you wouldn't know that, but that is the case. We also historically have ranked very high in our state portion, just comparing us to other states. So in 2010, we were ranked 9th. In 2011 and 12, we were ranked 8th in the country. And for the last 2 years, we have been ranked 7th. You hear that a lot coming from politicians these days, saying the state is making a great effort compared to their counterparts from across the country. But if you look at overall funding, and we'll get into that in a little more detail, our children are not getting the resources that they need to get the education that they need to be competitive in the 21st century. North Carolina is structured very differently because our school boards in this state are fiscally dependent upon another body, the county commission, for their local funds. 90% of the local boards of education in this country do not rely upon another elected body for their local funds. So that is one thing about North Carolina that is very unique, along with Virginia, Maryland, and then there's some states that are mixed. The funding responsibility in this state after the Great Depression was kind of the following division: that the state would provide for the current expense, kind of what you need to operate your schools on a daily basis, and the county commissioners were to provide the capital funds. That line really starting in about the 1950s, started getting blurry. And it's gotten blurrier and blurrier and blurrier to where locally now county commissioners are having to pick up a huge amount of the current expense to operate the schools on a daily basis. The way the state stepped in on the capital side was starting in the 1950s. About every 10 years, they would put a major infusion of dollars into our public schools. We have not had that major infusion since the 1996 school bond issue. That was $1.8 billion. A lot of people say, well, what about the lottery? Well, the lottery, even in its heyday of providing capital funds, did not provide that much, and we are now down from the promised 40% of lottery funds for capital down to about 17%. So that is a huge shift by the state, starting really when we went into the Great Recession. Enrollment in our public schools statewide is 1.46 million for the 2014-15 school year. We don't have the numbers yet for this school year. Those are calculated typically in October, so we should have them very soon. The average increase over the last 10 years is 0.8% each year. Charter school student enrollment, and those are considered public schools in this state, for last year was 64,186 students. So you're talking about 1.46 million and 64,000. For those of you who pay attention to what the General Assembly does, a lot of our debate is around kind of that rub between LEAs, local education agencies, and charter schools. But you can see the disproportionate number of students. One of the numbers that I think is really stark is the number of students we now have on free and reduced lunch. And we had in 2002, 42.4% of our students were on free and reduced lunch. We are now, last school year, at 55.9% of our students statewide are on free and reduced lunch. That's a huge jump and a huge issue for public schools across the state. So I'm going to share with you some graphs, and you have a copy of these, and we're going to walk through them. We've talked about some of these numbers already, the rankings, and there's the free and reduced lunch. One of the other things is, where does our money go? 93.7% of our K-12 spending in 2013-14 went to salaries and benefits. That does not leave a lot of money for things, for books, for buying digital resources for students, for paper, for toilet paper, all of those things that are necessary throughout the school day. So this is what our state has done since 1969-70 through 2014-15. In 1969-70, 52.5% of the state budget went to the public schools. It was a great year. I was born that year. So we, as you can see, had a pretty precipitous decline over the years, and we have really hung out in the kind of mid-30s for quite a while. Last year we were at 37.8% of the state budget. Now part of that is the growth of Medicaid. Medicaid has eaten up more and more of our state budget, but it hasn't eaten up that much more of our state budget. So this next chart is a historical look at the number of students we have and how much we are funding them on a per pupil basis. So your orange line is your number, your per pupil amount. So the In 2008, 2009, we were spending $5,779 per student. The blue line is the number of students we have. As you can see, we have been growing substantially since 2009-10. There was a dip that year. Does anybody know why there was a dip that year? We changed the cutoff date for kindergarten. That was the year that we changed that age requirement for kids to be able to enter kindergarten. It used to be October 16th, and we moved it back to the end of August. So we knew 2 years out that we were going to have a dip that year, so that's why that dip does exist. So these are new numbers. We have the 2015-16 numbers. We now actually are above where we were in 2008-9 on a per pupil basis in spending. So we were at $5,779. We're now at $5,881 per student. This chart showed the blue line is the number of students in our schools. The red bars are the number of full-time personnel who are available to our students in our schools throughout the day. So as you can see, we have had quite a dip in the number of adults interacting with our children, making the schools run, while we have continued to grow the number of children we are educating in this state. A few other things that are important to note. We like to talk about teacher pay. The teacher is the person that is obviously the closest to the student in the classroom. We hit our high water mark in 2001-2 when we were ranked 21st in the nation. And you'll see in just a minute, we still, though, did not meet the national average. We never met that goal. In 2007, 2008, we had started to slip by then. We were to 26. 2013-14, which is the most recent year that the data is available. This data has been published for years by NEA. It is published in March, and obviously there is a lag time, but we were 47th in the country. So when we get to 2014-15, which was last school year, which is what will be coming out this coming March, I don't know how much we will move. The General Assembly did make a pretty good investment that year, on average a 5% increase for teachers. We got our beginning teacher pay, that first jump up that year. But other states were moving their teacher pay at the same time. So it is not a stagnant number that you are chasing year after year. And then this year with teacher pay, we got the beginning teacher pay up to $35,000, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then the teacher, we had collapsed our salary schedule, which used to be every year you moved up a step, down to 5-year bands. And only those teachers that moved from one band to another band got an increase this year. So that means only 32% of our teachers got a pay raise this year, a permanent pay raise. I'm not quite sure why anyone would go into the teaching profession anymore, unless they enjoy having second jobs. So our per pupil spending for 2008-2009 was, we were 42nd. By 2013-14, we were 47th. So we are continuing to slip on that measure as well. So this is the comparison of our teacher pay, which is the line at the bottom, compared to the national average. You can see where we did get the closest at the beginning of the graph that we talked about, and that's why you hear a lot about we did get to be 21st, but we still didn't make that average. But you can see how wide it has gotten. The last number, the 47,783, is DPI's estimate for the 2014-15 school year, and we don't have the national to compare that to. So where do we rank in the Southeast? This is beginning teacher pay as of this school year. We were able to collect this data from these states. And the only state that has beginning teacher pay higher than North Carolina as a state is Alabama. But let's look at the average. Now, these numbers are a couple of years old. There is a lag, as I said. We are second to last. Thank goodness for Mississippi. We used to be able to say thank goodness for Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, West Virginia. This is a real problem for our state. We have got to move up this chart. To look at North Carolina and really compare it to the New Yorks and the Pennsylvanias is probably not a real relevant comparison. But when you are comparing yourselves to your surrounding states, that is a very legitimate comparison to be making.
West Virginia
That means we were taking last year's chart and we were updating it, and we forgot to drop out Virginia's old number. So I apologize for that. So this is a really interesting chart, and I think it tells a lot about why we see that, yes, we may be spending more per student now than we ever have, but that we are still seeing that we're having that gap widen between the number of students that we have and the number of adults that we have throughout the day with them. This is a chart that looks at what we are spending in total receipts. That's the first column. The second column is your number of students. The third is your increase in salaries and benefits. Now, we've talked about salaries some, but what we haven't talked about is benefits. And that is the cost of our state health plan and our retirement system. And as you can see in the last two columns, those numbers have gone up pretty substantially. When you start multiplying that by the number of employees we have in our school systems across the state, that is eating up a huge portion of the increase that we are receiving every year in the state budget. So we're not essentially buying anything more with those increases. We are just using a large portion of that to basically maintain the status quo with our employees and their benefit level. This shows some of the loss in funds since 2008, 2009 through the 2014-15 school year. Now, some of these did change this year. We were able to get a little bit more money into textbooks this year, but I believe all the rest of those hold essentially to be true to last year. So what I would like to do now is just, for those of you who were here the last time when I came, this is where I'm going to change it up a little bit. How many of you have been in a public school within the last 3 years? How many of you have been in an elementary school in the last 3 years? How many of you have been in a K-3 classroom in the last 3 years? Have you seen a difference from 3 years ago to what is going on in a K-3 classroom? One of the biggest changes that we have seen is with the Read to Achieve initiative, which is requiring that all children read at grade level by the end of 3rd grade. It has really changed the dynamic of those classrooms because we now are assessing those kids more. We start assessing them in kindergarten. It's not a test at that point. They don't do the formal testing until 3rd grade. But the way those classrooms are structured has changed dramatically in the last 3 years since that law went into effect. We had a member of the Senate within the last 2 weeks talk about our public schools. And in his comments about our public schools, he said we are doing a lot of things that are antiquated. And the one example that he talked about was having teacher assistants. Teacher assistants are in those K-3 classrooms. They are a really important part, and I'll talk a little bit more about how important they are. He compared those teacher assistants to office supply stores still buying manual typewriters to sell. That is as far from the truth for those of you who have been in those classrooms as we can get these days. He talked about studies about teacher assistants. The only studies that have been done on the effectiveness of teacher assistants were back in the 1990s. We have really changed the credentialing for teacher assistants. No Child Left Behind required that that those folks be credentialed. We have changed how we use teacher assistants. They are no longer the folks who run and make copies for us anymore. They are instructional coaches in each of those classrooms. They are absolutely vital to those classrooms being able to move those children, those diverse groups of children. I mean, those schools do not even look like the schools of the 1990s. I mean, think about all the different languages that are in schools now. We have school districts that have over 100 different languages in them now. Without those folks there to help with the instruction of those children, we are going to fail our public school students. Our organization is a strong supporter of teacher assistants. We've looked very carefully at that issue, and we think it is really important that we get elected legislators and candidates into the classroom to see what is really going on. Not just talk about studies or even talk about data, but to get them in the classroom so they can really see what is going on, what teachers are dealing with on a daily basis. And we think that is the best approach at this point, to open up eyes and see what's really going on. So I'd be happy to take any questions.